conference. It's my pleasure to introduce now our second keynote speaker of the conference, Ian Parker. Ian Parker is an honorary professor of education at University of Manchester and a visiting professor in the Department of Psychosocial Studies at Birkbeck College in London. He's also co-director of the Discourse Unit, which is a virtual community of discourse researchers. There are some cards here for people interested in that will guide you to the right website for exploring some materials. They also have an online journal on which several papers working with Lacan can be found in the Journal of Critical Psychology. Ian published several books. One of them is called Lacanian Psychoanalysis, published by Routledge. On behalf of that, he also published last year with David Pavón-Cuéllar a book called Lacan Discourse Event. It's published both in Spanish and in English, which are interesting books since they give a flavor of how Ian Parker uses Lacan. He's not a conventional user of Lacanian theory. He kind of creates always a mixture and a connection with the field of critical psychology, because that's his other field where he's active, kind of a critical stance vis-a-vis how psychology is used by us in our contemporary world. So Ian also has several papers and books on critical psychology. He also edited a volume with key papers on critical psychology, I guess 2 years ago. And then he's also an analyst. He's a member of CFAR, the Center for Freudian Analysis and Research in London, and his practice is based in Manchester. So for today, he gave us a nice title, The Function and Field of Speech and Language in Neoliberal Education. Of course, he's playing with the title of Lacan's paper, but I'm pretty sure that what Ian will present today will hardly be a repetition of what Lacan said. But I'm very curious to hear Ian Parker himself on that.
Thank you for inviting me to this conference. Thanks for inviting me to this conference. I spoke some years ago at the conference in Copenhagen, and it's very nice to be back in this community of researchers. The function and field of speech and language in psychoanalysis was a text that Lacan revised and refamed for publication in the Écrit. In his review of the field of psychoanalysis in 1953, which was also an intervention, Lacan drew attention to the language of psychoanalysis itself and what it meant to speak within it, to speak in and against that language. He cuts against the organizations that speak for psychoanalysis, but which bury the question of truth in a series of bureaucratic procedures. These bureaucratic procedures accomplish two things. On the one hand, they gear the practice of psychoanalysis to conceptions of biology, behavior, and social amelioration that underpin other rival forms of knowledge, psychiatry, psychology, psychotherapy. On the other hand, they inscribe Freudian ideas within the tracks of popular discourse to make it acceptable. So Lacan's question in the preface to this text is suitably ambiguous, double-edged. He says, as a method based on truth and demystification of subjective camouflage, does psychoanalysis display an incommensurate ambition to apply its principles to its own corporation, that is, to psychoanalysis' conception of their role in relation to the patient, their place in intellectual society, their relations with their peers, and their educational mission. And we need to take seriously the incommensurability of psychoanalysis as such to this task on the one hand, and the application of psychoanalysis to it on the other. A way of doing that is to attend to the problems Lacan describes, and then attend to the way that a kind of psychoanalytic logic is embedded in organizations today in times of neoliberalism. Our psychoanalytic sensitivity to speech and language in culture, and in the institutions that formalize and reproduce that culture, can then enable us to clarify and take a distance from that logic. Here, we will take the case of higher education, our own corporation, in which we're required to adhere to a specific form of educational mission, one which is often spelled out for us in the university mission statement. Notwithstanding Lacan's question about applying the psychoanalytic method in his later preface to the function and field of speech and language in psychoanalysis, or precisely as occasion for it, he follows a first diagnosis of what he refers to as current problems of psychoanalysis, which he glosses as the child's education by its mother, Samaritan-type aid, and dialectical mastery. And he makes this claim. In order to home in on the causes of this deterioration of analytic discourse, one may legitimately apply psychoanalytic method to the collectivity that sustains it. So the first principle concerns application, which will be complicated as the text proceeds. Already we can note that these three problems are fueled by a presumption that there is a point external to the subject from which knowledge can be put to work. This is a presumption that since 1953 has been exacerbated inside psychoanalysis by the turn to developmental models that then inform a kind of pedagogy about and for mothers, by an ethical imperative to help and be seen to help others, and by the use of counter-transference as a kind of machinery through which the knowledge the analyst thinks they have of the unconscious of the analysand is clarified so that more accurate interpretations can be delivered. So the first point concerning application also concerns the position of the researcher, our own position. The three problems Lacan raises are to do with imaginary conceptions of the constitution of the object and the different stages of cyclical development, the convergence of treatment with some kind of existential phenomenology, and the bringing to bear of the analyst's being on the progress of analysis. Lacan points out that what the problems have in common is the temptation of abandoning the foundation of speech. Why? Because when the analyst turns themselves into one who knows, when they really believe that they do know how others develop, feel, and speak, the transformative power of speech is replaced with an interpretative grid. This is an irresolvable conundrum for academics who would like to see the world conform to their own favourite theory of it. If, as Lacan claims, speech commits its author by investing its addressee with a new reality, then in psychoanalysis as such, in the clinic, we are not only implicated in what we describe, but we make it possible for the analysand to create and commit themselves to a new reality. In this text, the creation and commitment to a new reality is conceptualized by Lacan as true speech. He says, analysis can have as its goal only the advent of true speech and the subject's realization of his history in its relation to a future. This second principle is one we will always, in the kind of research we carry out into work organizations, violate to some extent, because we're noticing explicating and writing about what is going on. We're doing these things in a way that does not directly and immediately enable our participants to produce and then enact interpretations themselves as they would in analysis. Instead, we're implicated in this process at a distance, perhaps facilitating at a second remove what Lacan is describing here when he writes, in its symbolizing function, speech tends toward nothing less than a transformation of the subject to whom it is addressed by means of the link it establishes with the speaker, namely by bringing about a signifying effect. Third, the wall of language. Let's move on from the second principle concerning speech, which application sabotages to some extent, to this third point, the role of language. The human being speaks, but it is, Lacan says, because the symbol has made him man, or made her, we should say, along with the binary opposition that governs how each sex is positioned as gender in language today. And we will see more of this in a moment. Lacan's attention to the structure of language not only gives an opening to something approximating discourse analysis in our research outside the clinic, or even, we might say, Lacanian discourse analysis, but it also cues us into the shape of a problem at the very moment when we think it is the shape of a solution. That is, when Lacan refers to the wall of language at different points in the text, it is to indicate that this language is now, and remember this now is 60 years ago, riddled with psychoanalysis itself. And instead of being riddled with holes by psychoanalysis, it is now, this language, stuffed full of psychoanalysis, so that the riddles we imagine that we're solving are often of our own making. This gives another sense, nachträglich, from where we're reading this, to Lacan's argument that we must be attentive to the unsaid that dwells in the holes in discourse, and to his rebuttal of popular psychoanalytic discourse, which searches for the unconscious underneath language or in a pre-verbal domain before it. For, Lacan insists, the unsaid is not to be understood like knocking coming from the other side of the wall. He's quite explicit about this problem. He says, with the mythical manipulations of our doctrine, we bring the subject yet another opportunity to become alienated in the decomposed trinity of the ego, the superego, and the id, for example. And Lacan is using terms marked with the asterisk, ego, superego, id, that were introduced and popularized by the English translations of Freud. And he continues, here it is the wall of language that blocks speech. And the precautions against verbalism that are a theme of the discourse of normal men in our culture merely serves to increase its thickness. So, the third principle concerns language and what we could call the function and field of psychoanalytic language, and then also speech, psychoanalytic discourse, which inhabits institutions and our research today. Fourth, the gap, alienation and symptom. So this brings us to the way the gap between speech and language is produced and reproduced as a form of alienation and expressed as symptom. There are three aspects of this mutually constitutive relation between alienation and symptom that are important for us as we try to grasp this fourth principle, the gap between speech and language. And the first is the way that discourse presents itself as full at one moment and is emptied at the next. The way forms of discourse that pretend to give meaning then deaden it. Lacan refers to the antinomy immanent in the relations between speech and language, such that the more functional language becomes, the less suited it is to speech. And when it becomes overly characteristic of me alone, it loses its function as language. The second aspect of this gap is the yearning for relation with another that Lacan is happy enough in this text to gloss as intersubjectivity, which is driven by recognition that will flow through speech as the analysand speaks to the analyst, and it will be blocked by the very language that makes that speech possible. Here, Lacan comes close to a romantic humanist conception of the subject that already, of course, contains within it a tragic Freudian sting in the argument, when he writes that man's desire finds its meaning in the other's desire, not so much because the other holds the keys to the desired object, as because his first objective is to be recognized by the other. So the third aspect of the gap between speech and language is to be seen in its manifestation as symptom. And Lacan puts it like this: symptoms can be entirely resolved in an analysis of language because a symptom is itself structured like a language. A symptom is language from which speech must be delivered. There's another side to this fourth principle of the gap constitutive of alienation and the symptom, which is already at work in the symptom itself, which is, where there is the power of language, there is something that speaks. And this brings us to a fifth principle concerning what we could call resistance. This fifth principle also enables us to grasp the role of jokes in organizations. With respect to alienation, the alternation between action and knowledge is such that the symbolic function presents itself as a twofold movement in the subject. And Lacan indicates how this twofold movement is historically located, so that what is conceptualized as alienation of the subject in psychoanalysis is named and reconfigured today as alienation of the worker. Lacan says, in phase one, a man who works at the level of production in our society considers himself to belong to the ranks of the proletariat. In phase two, in the name of belonging to it, he joins a general strike. So with respect to the symptom, the obsessional character of alienation under capitalism leads to the fantasy that with the master's death, the subject will begin to live. But, Lacan says, in the meantime, he identifies with the master as dead, and is thus already dead himself. Now, to name this fifth principle resistance is fraught with difficulties, but this term, resistance, should be read here as shorthand for that which speaks of the conditions which constitute the subject, and which then and today has to navigate the tender trap of psychoanalytic discourse, which sets up an opposition between what Lacan calls the recourse to affectivity on the one hand, and the use of the verb to intellectualize on the other. Now what concerns him here is the dialectical incapacity, as he puts it, of the forms of psychoanalysis he rejects in 1953 to comprehend this opposition between affectivity and intellect. It is not, and it is crucial to recognize this, it's not that he's avoiding affect or that he's endorsing intellectualizing maneuvers of those who do avoid affect. Now, one way of approaching that opposition between affect and intellectualization in discourse is by taking jokes seriously. In a joke, we hear a strategy of engagement with power that closes over what it pretends to expose. Lacan says, it is truth, in fact, that throws off the mask in coming out of his mouth, but only so that the joke might take on another, more deceptive mask. This gives rise to an illusion of resistance, which serves to perpetuate what it aims to subvert. Sophistry that is merely a stratagem, logic that is merely a lure, comedy that tends merely to dazzle. The extraction of general principles from Lacan's text, even with the qualifications as to historical specificity that his reference to the proletariat reminds us of, needs to bear in mind how each principle functions in relation to the others. And this is where the question of application as the first principle brings us to a sixth principle, which concerns the specificity of the field of application of psychoanalytic method. That is, Lacan alerts us in this text to the clinic as a limited domain, as a site in which psychoanalysis works, when he writes, if the originality of the method derives from the means it forgoes, it is because the means that it refers for itself suffice to constitute a domain whose limits define the relativity of its operations. This could be read as a warning that psychoanalysis only applies in the clinic, and that any attempt to expand its field of operation would serve to misapply it. It would then be inappropriate to use psychoanalytic concepts to interpret and unravel the hidden meanings in the discourses and practice in non-psychoanalytic contexts, in non-psychoanalytic organizations. But, as Lacan has told us, psychoanalysis is present as a symbolic resource that structures, albeit in distorted form, the psychoanalytic institution, its own corporation. This is precisely part of the problem, that it structures the institution in a distorted form. And it is this very structuring that makes a work organization amenable to a psychoanalytic reading. So, the other way of reading Lacan's comments about the way that psychoanalytic method suffices to constitute a domain whose limits define the relativity of its operations is to take seriously the way that psychoanalytic language today inhabits and structures institutions such that psychoanalytic speech becomes a liability and an opportunity. It is both an opportunity and a liability in our attempts to deal with this function of psychoanalysis today as part of the wall of language. This is especially so, we might suspect, in the field of education, which has endeavoured to use psychoanalysis to understand the impossibility of its own mission and has encouraged a reflexive stance which borrows Freudian precepts. Well, Lacan has some caustic comments about education in his text, which include his complaints about a conception of analytic training that is like that of a driving school, which embeds his critique in comments about obsessional clock time in the universe we inhabit today, and about the brazen face of capitalist exploitation, as he puts it, which invites certain strategies of identification and resistance. We will encounter these issues when we turn to look at the shape of the problem that Lacan's psychoanalytic method has something to say about. The three problems of psychoanalysis that Lacan noticed 60 years ago have uncanny relevance to the problems we face in higher education today. It's uncanny because a specific domain of theory and practice that was then mainly outside the university sector has become part of the fabric of the wall of language that structures the management of academic activity. It's uncanny because its discourse, the discourse of psychoanalysis in its broadest, most inclusive, popularized form, informs not only institutional procedures, but also subjective responses through which lecturers and researchers cope with neoliberal demands on them and attempt to resist those demands. Neoliberalism intensifies this uncanny role of psychoanalysis with what looks like a return to classical liberal political economy of the 19th century, but with a twist. The twist is that in place of the ostensibly rationalist contractual relations between workers and capitalists, we now have an individual subject saturated with affect, so that their own investment in the workplace becomes a target of and a resource for management. So let's return to the three problems that Lacan identifies, starting with knowledge as grounding for education and interpretation. Neoliberal policies in the public sector are now being implemented by forms of new public management, NPM, that are characterized by a combination of free market rhetoric and intensive managerial control practices, according to Chris Lorenz in a marvelous paper published last year in Critical Inquiry. Chris Lorenz draws attention to the way that the reign of NPM, New Public Management, entails a transformation of the way that knowledge is assumed to function in universities. Effectiveness, the quality of being able to bring about an effect, is replaced by efficiency, which pertains to the operation of the system as such. The illusion of the difference between the two concepts, effectiveness and efficiency, enables a reduction of efficiency to cost efficiency, which boils down to perpetual reduction in funding, in which each cut in spending is simply the springboard to the next. Assessment of value then revolves around the course module, which is defined in terms of fixed quantity of time investment by both its producers and its consumers, and this requires the standardization of knowledge as formulated in the Bologna process. The kind of knowledge of work practices to achieve maximum efficiency in the university thus also requires that the knowledge produced in the university be directly observable and measurable. And to grasp this, Chris Lorenz turns to Harry Frankfurt's analysis of bullshit to notice statements that comprise NPM discourse. 1, statements that identify the quality of education with quantitative educational output, quali-speak. 2, statements that identify the academic worth of research with economic market value, valuarization speak. 3, statements that identify the underfunded public universities of the US, Netherlands, Germany or France with the top private universities of the US, top speak or excellence speak. In line with the shift from effectiveness to efficiency, there's a corresponding shift from truth to the circularity of knowledge and the effects statements might have within it. As Lorenz points out, bullshit does not refer to the truth as such. It is neither based on a belief that what is being claimed is true, nor, as in a lie, that it is untrue. He turns to Harry Frankfurt to spell out the implications of this with respect to appeals to the authority of the truth. The bullshitter, Frankfurt writes, ignores these demands altogether, and by virtue of this, bullshit is a greater enemy of the truth than lies are. In Lacanian terms, we might say that it is as if the other, as a site of demands for truth to be spoken, is all but abolished. This shift also has implications for the way that knowledge is invested with power, the way it's invested with affect, and then necessarily so given the gendered division of labour in this culture, the way that it recruits men and women to it. The increase in importance of emotional labour in the private and public sectors means that there is a distribution of power in management, in higher education, where the executive positions are overwhelmingly occupied by men, whilst middle management is more the domain of women. And this, according to Valerie Haig, splits the male decision makers from the tier of people who implement them, the decisions. So let's now turn to the second problem Lacan identifies, that which grounds treatment in a stance underpinned by charitable concern. New public management in the university sector, and not only there, claims to be anti-bureaucratic, a claim that is suspect from the outset. But the warrant for that claim lies, in part, in the way that work in the service sector has recruited the stereotypical qualities of women's intuitive and relational activities in the home that harness them to an ethos of customer care. In the process, this feminization of work that Ali Hochschild describes in her accounts of emotional labour also recruits, to borrow a phrase from Judith Butler, the passionate attachment of subjects to their work. subjects, the passionate attachment of subjects to their own identity in their relation to work and to the organizations in which they work. So we're clearly drawn into a psychoanalytic frame of reference of some kind where we're trying to grasp this. And this is spelled out by some recent researchers into the gendering of university knowledge production. Again, Valerie A. To conceive of people as holding identifications within social space offers a productive way to conceive power intersecting the personal and institutional, the conscious and the unconscious, and thus to explain the process through which the desires of individuals could be articulated into affect-laden social orders, including those of higher education. Now, critiques of Hochschild, which claim that customer service interactions are double-edged, that they are satisfying as well as distressing for the worker, merely serve to underscore the depth of alienation that she's describing. And Lacanians would, of course, be attentive to satisfaction as indicating that there is something symptomatic at play in such a description, rather than a happy, healthy, normal state of affairs. A reflexive attention to the role of emotions at work becomes part of an ethics of gendered care that ensures that occupants of positions of executive and middle management know their place, they perform it, and they feel it. That is, men usually make decisions at executive level, and often it is women who are told to implement those decisions. So the link between gender and emotion brings us to the third problem Lacan identifies, which concerns the performance of expertise tied to power that is assumed to ground the success of analysis. One of the necessary paradoxes of the simultaneous blurring and reinforcement of hierarchical management practice in higher education today is that while everyone is invited to become a little master, self-sufficient unto themselves, able to compete in the academic marketplace, they are also inclined to agonize about their rights and responsibilities, to the point where they reconfigure themselves as little slaves, beholden to the recognition of their managers, colleagues, and through the machinery of teaching quality evaluations to their students. In the UK, this is officially instituted through the National Student Survey, for example, and in the United States, unofficially through the Rate My Professor websites. A researcher subject to this regime will often grin and bear it, hoping that it will end sometime, but will usually not be willing to risk their own already precarious position and speak openly to refuse it. Hence, Lacan notes, the slave can accept to work for the master and give up jouissance in the meantime, and unsure as to when the master will die, he waits. And meantime, he suffers, symptomatically, and expresses that suffering in jokes that pretend to resist it. Crucial to this process of regulation and self-regulation is a quasi-therapeutic attempt to reflect upon and master what is felt, which has prompted claims that universities have been subject to a regime of therapeutic education. Now, reductive though such a reading of the process is, it does draw attention to the management of emotion as part of the apparatus of power, so that command is supplemented or even replaced with entreaty and appeal for understanding of the predicament of the manager by those they are attempting to pull into line. We can notice a number of different responses to this by lecturers and researchers. One first response is to conform to this inducement to self-mastery, which they often must do in the self-congratulatory accounts of academic progress required as part of research audit. A second response, linked to this strategy, which may be part of it, is to retreat into a cynical, ironic, detached non-relation to what is demanded. That which Lorenz, in a cryptic reference to strategies of disengagement by liberals under Nazism, refers to as inner immigration. A third response is to fold under the pressure, and the hidden injuries of the neoliberal university are here all too often invisible for those who are unable to conform, often leave higher education altogether. A fourth response is to offer oneself up as a living sacrifice. In practice, these responses coincide. They contradict each other and they overlap in the same subject as they confront a demand to give recognition to their masters and show through the performance of their emotional labour that they crave recognition themselves. It's via that matrix of responses that mockery, sarcasm, pitying contempt, and hopes for revenge and redemption are enacted. And this sets the scene for a logic of ideological fantasy at work that psychoanalysis is already implicated in, and which psychoanalysis can therefore help us to map. So the brief case example I'm going to describe is one in which I am, from the beginning, implicated. Suffice to say that this account is formulated in relation to me in a particular position, which includes some kind of attribution of knowledge to me as psychoanalyst. We see here staged a fantasy in which satisfaction, recognition, injury, and revenge are symptomatically mobilized. A logic of fantasy that is culturally, institutionally constructed. We might say that the space for this account is ordered according to a temporal logic, which is not that of linear segmented clock time. That's a temporal logic which Lacan says confirms his remarks on the definition he gave as to the confines of the psychoanalytic clinic, and which includes a subject's time for understanding, which includes, he says, a psychological factor that escapes us by its very nature. Lacan spells out this logic like this. It is the certainty anticipated by the subject in the time for understanding, which, through the haste that precipitates the moment of concluding, determines the other's decision that makes the subject's own movement an error or truth. So the account I'll describe can be understood as taking place in the third moment of an organizational crisis. I questioned management practices in my university concerning workload and appointment procedures, which led to my suspension from the organization. That's the first moment. There followed a protracted campaign over several months by the union, students and colleagues in other universities. A second moment. This was followed by a disciplinary hearing, lifting of my suspension, my refusal to return to work in the same department, and my resignation from the university, which I condense here as the third moment, the moment of concluding. At that point, in that third moment, I met a colleague from my department and had a long conversation over several hours in which something like a time for understanding was created between us. It was a conversation that reminds me of Lacan's remark that the speech value of a language is gauged by the intersubjectivity of the we it takes on. This colleague knows that I work as a psychoanalyst. We speculated together about the background to the events and the role of the new head of department and the dean of faculty. The head of department was an ambitious, obedient bureaucrat, a woman who was exactly in the position of female middle manager, implementing executive decisions, and who would do this not simply by issuing a command that this or that task be carried out, but by publicly addressing their disappointment to those who did not comply. The dean of faculty was a man simultaneously feminized by the process of bowing to demands of managers above him, and masculinized, forced to assert his authority over subordinates. And the imperative to do so was perhaps exacerbated by his own racialized position, an aspect of the power structure that was also tellingly, perhaps, absent from our reflections on it in this conversation. That is, we didn't refer to his race. At one late point in our conversation, we recalled how, when the dean had arrived in the university a few years before, other key figures in the faculty who had earlier supervised his PhD greeted the appointment with triumphant claims that he would do their bidding, and the phrase used at the time was that he would be under their thumb. He quickly acted to sack both his PhD supervisor and another member of the supervision team. I commented that this was an Oedipal struggle, and my colleague was a psychologist, but remember that psychology in the UK excludes and tries to forget Freudian non-science. Ask me what I meant. What does it mean? Oedipal. I take this to be the first moment in the temporal logic of the staging of the fantasy. He then asked me directly whether I had deliberately provoked management. I said that I did not know that the response would be so sharp and fast, but that because I believed in the unconscious, I supposed that there was something in me that must have known what was going to happen. I take this to be the second moment, the time for understanding. Now we come to the third moment, the moment of concluding. My colleague had already told me at length how the head of department patronized him and how angry it made him feel. He told me he felt that the only strategy he could adopt was to do exactly what he was told, but in the spirit of what he called dumb insolence, which would convey to others, and covertly to her as well, that he did not really believe what he was doing, and this would maintain his own dignity. He wanted to conform in such a way as to force the manager to reveal what a bully she was. And then he said, we come to the moment where a fantasy is formulated. I want her to headbutt me in the face in public. Now the point is not to delve into the psychical development of this subject, to pretend to understand what he meant in some kind of existential phenomenology, or to bring the analyst's being to play in an interpretation of the fantasy. Instead, we see here some matrix of fantasy in an organization. But the kind of analysis we need is one which locates the fantasy in the context of prevailing discourses of power and subjectivity. These discourses are not unlocked by psychoanalysis, rather they include it, and that is precisely why we were able to read them. I'm going to conclude with 6 points. The first is that there are many different, competing, contradictory and overlapping forms of psychoanalytic discourse at work in the field of culture and in organizations today, not only Lacanian. Specific domains are constituted by these approaches whose limits define the relativity of their operations. The second point is that I have extracted some principles from one of Lacan's early texts to read this situation. These issues will undoubtedly look very different from psychoanalysis of the later Lacan. Third point is that the logic of fantasy is not merely a discursive construction, which may then be dismantled so that those subject to it may speak the truth, for it already speaks of enjoyment within political economy. Fourth, our attempt to grasp the reality of psychoanalytic reasoning outside the clinic must be grounded in the specificity of the clinic as psychoanalytic practice, but also take account of the way that this reasoning structures subjectivity in contemporary culture. The fifth, this means that our reading of these discourses that flow through culture and organizations are not from a neutral ground external to them. The sixth, final point, is that the proliferation of psychoanalytic forms of discourse, modes of reasoning, narratives of experience, and embodied affective responses to work today means that we're faced with exactly the questions that Lacan was concerned with 60 years ago, but more so. That is, psychoanalysis has come to structure what Jacques Miller calls an age of interpretation, in which the correct Lacanian response would perhaps be to cut the discourse rather than feed it. Neoliberal education is a field of speech and language which is amenable to a Lacanian reading, but that is where our problems begin and against which we attempt to speak the truth. Thank you.
excellent idea.
Can you hear me? Thank you. I really enjoyed it, and I think I largely agree with your diagnosis of the British University. I was just a bit unsure what you mean by education, because for me, if education is to do with teaching, I think in British universities in a way code. That's better. Can you hear me? Okay. So I think
You can still hear.
you can still hear me. Okay. No, but I think that education, and especially teaching, has become one of the few places and spaces where you can still exercise and enjoy some kind of intellectual freedom. I think with all of the other spheres in university, like raising questions in relationship to, openly corrupt decision making, or trying to go on our alternative publishing path, all of those things will be punished. But if you by education mean teaching, I think in a way that would be one of the spheres where you still do have a sense of freedom and liberty in the British University. So maybe if you could just say what you mean by education. It's just a really broad question.
I agree with you that there is that space. It is very paradoxical, and in a way, that very freedom to speak and reflect about what we're doing gives more opportunity for neoliberal management to harness that reflexivity and to turn it into part of the apparatus of power. So it's a double-edged effect. The freedom is the subjection at the same time, but that freedom is very important. I have space to write this kind of thing and get it published, perhaps in a journal, and I speak about it in other universities. I still have other positions in other universities. Yes, that's very important. So education, I would see as something, generally speaking, impossible, which pervades contemporary society, where there is an ethos of education and the idea that it is good to be educated. But it's a specific kind of structure in the universities and specific to different kinds of universities. But to some extent or another, there is still that space of reflection within it.
You speak about locating the fantasy in the context of prevailing discourses of power and subjectivity. We're talking about a new public management and the neoliberal agenda, let's say. I've been very struck by the way in which the public domain has imported models of how to organize things that were dominant in the 80s and 90s of the last century in the private sector. It's almost like models which are no longer appropriate in the private sector are being recycled in order to keep large numbers of consultants busy in the public sector. And you're describing some of the consequences of that in the educational sector, but of course it's happening in other sectors too. We saw Lacan in his later work trying to find a place of getting, behind, underneath, trying to do something in order to break with the imaginary effects that he could see from his earlier work. For example, the way in which discourse became a kind of an imaginary thing, rather than a socially constructed relation to the unconscious that was, let's say, dialectical in nature. And I'm just wondering, when you say these issues would undoubtedly look very different from psychoanalysis of the later Lacan, whether you could just tease us a little bit with something around that.
Thanks for that. Yes, the thing about the infusion of management strategies from the private sector into the public sector, I think precisely comes about through the neoliberal deregulation and privatization of public organizations. So it then makes perfect sense for those management practices to be used in the public sector organizations, including in the universities. And Chris Lorenz, in his paper, notes that whereas it used to be the business school that looked to the debates and practices in the social sciences to think about how they should do their work. Now things are turned the other way round, so that the rest of the university looks to the business school to think about how it should do its work. So you've got this relay happening. Now, when we come to Lacan, I briefly adverted to what later Lacan's response might be to these issues by saying that we should perhaps not feed the psychoanalytic discourse, not pander to that discourse and simply keep it circulating, but do something different with it. And you know, the idea comes with the cut. And I'm unsure exactly how to do that in this kind of setting. I suppose what I could have done in that discussion with my colleague is made some kind of psychoanalytic intervention which would have stopped that fantasy and questioned how that fantasy was staged. But it's a very different matter to try and do that with you here in a description of that interaction. So what it means to cut is something that is a question for our own practice when we're confronted with that psychoanalytic discourse in our organizations, and that's a difficult enough question. But what it is to do it when we're describing it in an academic presentation is another question again, which I don't have the answer to, except to insist that with Lacan, that the unconscious that he speaks about was not discovered, it was invented, that it comes about at a certain point in history, and that we should, in our practice, be able to conceptualize the possibility of it ending. You know, keeping that historical frame around the work that we're doing, either as clinical practitioners or as organizational researchers. Okay. No, go on. But while you're getting the microphone, I should say that I was very much affected by Carl's comment after I gave a paper at the Copenhagen conference in which I said that psychoanalytic categories apply specifically to the clinic, and we should be very careful about elaborating them beyond the clinic. Carl said to me, so does that mean we have to flush all our research down the toilet? And I've thought about that in the years since. I thought how can we think about the role of psychoanalytic discourse in constituting the way we live our lives outside the clinic, and what would be a way of thinking about the relevance of psychoanalysis to it. So Carl is there somewhere prompting me to come up with this paper, especially speaking to this conference.
I was interested in a lot of your paper, of course, but when you said the kind of analysis we need is one which locates the fantasy in the context of prevailing discourses of power and subjectivity, could you say some more about that?
Yes. What I mean by that is exactly the discourses which tell us that what is important is our own subjective response, is our own affect, our own feelings about what is happening, and the way that we perform those feelings in relation to our colleagues and our managers when we try to account for what is going wrong in the organization. So everything is filtered through an emotional response, and in our discourse about that emotional response, things are filtered through a kind of psychoanalytic, quasi-psychoanalytic therapeutic mode of description. That's what I mean by the institutional relations of power and subjectivity. That's the context. So that's what I want to do. I want to situate this particular staging of a fantasy not in the particular life trajectory of this colleague who told it to me, but in the conditions in which he was trying to make sense of what was happening, and in the kind of responses that he thought were appropriate to deal with those conditions.
Ian, thanks very much indeed for your talk. Just following up really on that, yesterday I was giving a presentation that was again about an educational institution, further education, but focusing on the issue of deadlocks and in a sense you seem to be talking a little bit about a deadlock where it was extremely difficult for a number of people to communicate with each other. That might be a bit of an exaggeration, but along those lines. And you gave us the example of your colleague, you gave us the example of yourself. And I wondered, on reflection, whether you had any notions of how you might have acted otherwise in that situation. Or indeed how maybe your colleagues had acted otherwise. Was there any way in which some kind of opening up of communication could have been possible? Was there any way in which the fantasies, if you like, that you sort of said you had unconsciously and possibly your colleague had about the headbutt, those kinds of things, is there any way in which those could have been sort of traversed?
I don't know. I've thought about this a lot, and it's something that we discussed together, me and my close colleagues in the department. Some of them have now left the department. Some of them have decided that their strategy is to keep quiet and to live their lives outside of the institution. The different strategies that people have taken. For me, maybe it's precisely because it is a deadlock, I cannot think of another way that I could have acted. I cannot think of it. I suppose what I've done here in this paper, because it's drawing from the 1953 Lacan, where there is a concern with intersubjectivity rather than deadlock, I've arrived at one way of framing what is happening here to make sense of the conversation that I had with my colleague. Yeah, maybe the account would look a little bit different if it took deadlock seriously as a main analytic category, conceptual device to try and make sense of it. But in terms of act in that context, I cannot think of another alternative. It's interesting, but I can't.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that, Ian. I was wondering whether I could maybe connect to the theme of intersubjectivity that you've mentioned. Because you talked a lot about new public management and how certain fantasies are related to the way in which new public management frames and in a sense over-determines organizational relations. And I was wondering whether I could ask you maybe to share some of your reflections on the role of the student in this, as, I guess in the discourse of new public management, as a client. And you talked a bit about emotional labor and passionate attachment. And I was wondering whether you have any ideas on whether the student plays a supporting, but perhaps also in some sense perhaps a traversing role in relation to the fantasies that emerge.
Yeah, and that certainly the positioning of the student is very important in all of this, and the apparatus relies on the student playing their part within this, conforming to the demand to give assessment through, in Britain, the National Student Survey, agreeing to speak within the terms of the categories that are set out by management as they try and give an evaluation of the courses and then decide which courses or departments will carry on running and which ones will close. Yes, the position of the student is absolutely crucial. Now, depending on, I think it depends on how the student responds to that in relation to their other networks that they have available to them, whether they have other networks that are independent of the networks that are constituted in the organisation. And one of the advantages of being a student, I think, over that of being a lecturer or researcher, is that students often have many other kinds of networks and forms of support and forms of identification through which they could refuse the demands of the neoliberal management. The day that I was suspended, I was due to chair a session given by a postgraduate student, an open seminar, and the chairing of the session was taken over by my partner, Erica Berman, who's now left LMU, now in Manchester University. An announcement was read out by one of the postgraduate students that I had been suspended. Now, I had been specifically told in my letter of suspension that I should not discuss this with anybody. So immediately it was broken. The silence was broken. And in the disciplinary charges, which were also levelled against my partner for chairing the session, she was accused of allowing the statement to be read out and thereby causing anxiety among the students. Now, you see how it works. Now, but what actually happened was that the students were able to immediately mobilize and use their other networks in order to refuse that emotionalizing of their position, which would recruit them into being good students. So I think the answer is, yes, they have to be maintained in that position, and it includes exactly the kind of emotional labour, demands for emotional labour that I've been describing, but they can refuse it and do something different. They can.
Oh, thanks very much for your presentation. My question is on the issue of the notion of the joke that you talk about earlier in the presentation, in terms of the joke or humour as a way of sort of feeling like one is resisting but actually being sort of reincorporated into, say, the discourse that might have given rise to it. My own research at the moment is on people who have spoken out, but in the context of banks, so people who have spoken out against corruption that they're seeing in banks. And the role of humour and jokes is a really interesting one. It seems to be the people, it's obviously an extremely stressful and painful thing to go through for individuals that I've been interviewing, but the ones who've been down the track a little bit, and the ones that seem to occupy a sort of a subject position that they can live with, are the ones that turn around and make a joke out of the ridiculous situation that they've been through. The structural contradictions between a bank that has a CSR policy of transparency and yet completely covers up wrongdoing within it. And so I'm wondering, is there something about humour that's more than just reintegration in the discourse, if you like, from your own experiences, if you can speak to that idea?
Yes, well, you see, I think at the same time as we need to attend to the way that strategies of resistance might operate in an illusory way to confirm power relations, I think we mustn't lose sight of the fact that there is a possibility of resistance, and sometimes that resistance is successful. And in different kinds of situation, the joke can function as a way of confirming the sense of the idiocy of the organisation among those who are working together. I think it depends where the joke is told, to locate the joke, to try and get a sense of how it's operating in its relation to power. Yeah, I also buy George Orwell's statement, every joke is a tiny revolution. But, not all jokes are progressive. If we step out of psychoanalysis, we can see that jokes mobilize certain reactionary motifs and keep certain kinds of social relations going at the very moment they pretend to be overturning things. And psychoanalytically, we also need to attend to that. At the one moment, it locks us into the enjoyment that we have of our participation in this game, but at the other moment, it does provide a possibility of different kinds of social bond, link being formed with others who are also trying to resist.
Okay, we'll make a cut here. Just ending with one reflection, I think that Lacan kind of dropped the idea later on in his teaching of traversing the fantasy, in that traversing can be endless, and I think that the cut there is kind of the answer to the deadlock. And I think indeed not in continuing with long conversations on a subject, but with cutting the discussion in the midst of the point where it becomes very relevant for people, that it will stop there. So Ian is here all day, you can ask him many other questions, but the session comes to an end now.